The quiet hours of dawn on June 13, 2025, were shattered by the roar of jet engines across the Middle East. Israel had initiated a massive military campaign codenamed Operation Rising Lion. This was not a minor skirmish but a large-scale coordinated assault against its longtime adversary, Iran. More than 200 Israeli fighter jets, a formidable display of air power, streaked across the sky, their mission meticulously planned by the combined intelligence of the IDF and Mossad. The operation was the culmination of years of covert activities, including drone surveillance and on-the-ground intelligence gathering by operatives who had deeply infiltrated Iranian territory, providing a detailed map of critical infrastructure. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the world in a somber but resolute broadcast, declaring the operation a necessary preemptive strike. He framed the action as a decisive move to neutralize Iran's nuclear ambitions, which Israel had long viewed as an existential threat. "We will not allow a regime that openly calls for our destruction to possess the means to achieve it," he stated firmly, his words echoing across a world suddenly on edge. Netanyahu made it clear that this was not a one-off event, promising that the operation would continue for as many days as it takes to dismantle what he described as Iran's extensive network of terror and its weapons of mass destruction programs. The scale of the operation was breathtaking, targeting over 100 separate locations across Iran in a series of synchronized waves. The strikes were designed to cripple Iran's military and nuclear capabilities in a single, overwhelming blow. The complexity of the mission suggested a new level of military sophistication, blending advanced aerial firepower with deep cover espionage. Years of preparation had allowed Israeli forces to map out command and control centers, missile silos, and the personal movements of high-ranking officials. The world was witnessing a new and dangerous chapter in the long-running shadow war between the two regional powers, a conflict that had now burst violently into the open. This dramatic escalation did not occur in a vacuum. It followed a period of intensely heightened tensions that had been building for months. The region was already a tinderbox, still reeling from Iran's direct missile attacks on Israel in October 2024. Furthermore, the strategic landscape had been reshaped by the assassinations of key figures, including Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, and Hezbollah's Hassan Nasrallah. The collapse of the Assad regime in Syria in late 2024 had also weakened Iran's regional influence by severing crucial supply lines to its proxies. Operation Rising Lion was, in Israel's view, the logical and final step to secure its interests in a rapidly changing and increasingly hostile environment. The primary focus of Operation Rising Lion was Iran's controversial nuclear program. The Natanz uranium enrichment complex, a cornerstone of Iran's atomic ambitions, was hit with overwhelming force. Satellite images later revealed significant structural damage and raging fires that consumed key parts of the facility. Explosions were also reported near the heavily fortified Fordow nuclear site, built deep inside a mountain to protect it from such attacks. While the International Atomic Energy Agency, thankfully, reported no immediate signs of elevated radiation levels, suggesting the containment structures had held, the message was clear. Israel had demonstrated its ability to reach and damage even the most protected assets within Iran. Beyond the nuclear sites, the Israeli Air Force systematically dismantled a wide array of military infrastructure. Ballistic missile launch sites critical for Iran's projection of power were reduced to rubble. Air defense systems, including dozens of advanced radar installations and surface-to-air missile batteries, were destroyed in the opening salvos, effectively blinding Iran's military and allowing subsequent waves of jets to strike with near impunity. A strategic military base in Tabriz, which served as a major logistics and command hub, was also heavily targeted. The IDF later released footage claiming to show precision munitions striking their targets with devastating accuracy, showcasing the intelligence-led nature of the campaign. Perhaps the most shocking element of the operation was its success in decapitating Iran's military and political leadership. The strikes were not random. They were surgically precise, targeting specific individuals who formed the backbone of the regime's security apparatus. Hossein Salami, the powerful commander-in-chief of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, was killed. So too were Mohammad Bagheri, the chief of staff of Iran's armed forces, and his deputy, Gholam Ali Rashid. The list of high-profile casualties continued to grow, including Esmail Ghani, the commander of the elite Quds Force, and Ali Shamkhani, a senior politician who had been overseeing nuclear negotiations. The assault also took a heavy toll on Iran's scientific community, the very minds behind the nuclear program. Feridun Abbasi, a former head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, was among the dead, along with at least 6 other prominent nuclear scientists. This element of the operation was clearly aimed at crippling the program not just physically, but intellectually, removing the expertise needed to rebuild it. The sheer number of high-level figures eliminated in a single day sent a paralyzing shockwave through the Iranian regime, leaving a power vacuum at the very moment the country faced its greatest military crisis in decades. While Israel framed Operation Rising Lion as a series of precise military strikes, the reality on the ground was far more chaotic and tragic for ordinary Iranians. The sheer number and scale of the explosions inevitably led to collateral damage. Iranian state media, struggling to control the narrative amidst the confusion, began reporting grim figures. Initial counts cited over 70 people killed, with some estimates quickly climbing towards 80. The number of injured was even higher, with hospitals overwhelmed by more than 320 people suffering from burns, shrapnel wounds, and injuries sustained from collapsing structures. The distinction between military and civilian areas became tragically blurred in the chaos. In Tehran, a missile targeting a suspected command post struck near Nobonyad Square, a bustling urban area. The resulting explosion shattered windows for blocks, sending panicked civilians running for cover and igniting fires in nearby residential buildings. Eyewitness accounts described scenes of terror, with smoke and dust filling the air as emergency services struggled to navigate debris-strewn streets. These incidents provided heartbreaking images that quickly spread across global news networks, highlighting the devastating human cost of the conflict and complicating the Israeli narrative of a clean, surgical strike. The psychological impact on the Iranian population was immense. The strikes were not confined to remote desert locations, they brought the reality of war directly into the heart of major cities. Air raid sirens, a sound not heard on such a scale for decades, wailed through the night, forcing families into makeshift shelters. The sense of security, even in the capital, was shattered. The attacks on high-ranking officials also created a sense of vulnerability and fear, as it became clear that no one was safe. This widespread anxiety was compounded by the uncertainty of what would come next, as rumors of a ground invasion or further waves of attacks spread rapidly. The damage extended beyond immediate casualties. Key infrastructure, including power grids and communication lines near the targeted military sites, was disrupted, leading to blackouts and communication outages in several regions. The economic life of the country ground to a halt as people stayed home, businesses closed, and a palpable sense of dread settled over the nation. The fires at industrial and military sites cast a dark plume of smoke over the landscape, a visible symbol of the nation's suffering. For millions of Iranians, the geopolitical chess game between their leaders and Israel had suddenly and violently crashed into their daily lives, leaving behind a trail of death, destruction, and profound uncertainty. In the face of unprecedented attack and the loss of its top military leadership, Iran's response was one of fury and defiance. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the nation's ultimate authority, delivered a televised address that left no room for ambiguity. His face stern and his voice filled with cold anger, he labeled the Israeli assault a declaration of war and a foolish miscalculation. He promised that the criminal Zionist regime would face severe punishment for its aggression. He vowed that Iran would not be broken, but would emerge stronger from this trial by fire, calling on the nation to unite against the external enemy and to prepare for a long and difficult struggle ahead. With the IRGC's command structure in disarray, the regime moved swiftly to project an image of stability and control. Mohammad Pakpour, a seasoned and hardline general, was immediately appointed as the new commander of the IRGC. In his first public statement, Pakpour sought to rally his shaken forces, warning Israel that it had opened the gates of hell. He promised a response that would be felt not just in the Middle East, but across the world, declaring that the blood of Iran's martyrs would be avenged. The rapid appointment was a clear signal that despite the devastating losses, Iran's military apparatus would continue to function and was already planning its retaliation. The threat of retaliation extended far beyond Iran's own borders. The regime has spent decades cultivating a network of powerful proxy forces across the region, often referred to as the Axis of Resistance. Militant groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and various militias in Iraq and Syria were immediately placed on high alert. These groups, armed and funded by Tehran, represent a significant threat to Israeli and American interests. The world now waits to see if these allies will be unleashed in a coordinated, multi-front assault, a scenario that could plunge the entire Middle East into a catastrophic regional war. However, Iran's ability to orchestrate such a response has been complicated by recent events. The fall of the Assad regime in Syria disrupted a key land bridge for supplying weapons to Hezbollah, weakening its most powerful proxy. Furthermore, Israel had not been idle in the months leading up to Operation Rising Lion, conducting numerous strikes that degraded the capabilities of militias in both Syria and Iraq. While these groups remain dangerous, their capacity for a sustained, high-impact campaign may be diminished. Iran's new commanders now face the difficult task of crafting a response that is forceful enough to restore deterrence, but does not trigger an even more devastating Israeli counterattack. As news of the Israeli strikes reverberated globally, the reaction from Beijing was swift and unequivocal. China's foreign ministry issued a statement expressing deep concern over the escalation. It strongly condemned the attacks as a blatant violation of Iran's national sovereignty and a breach of the fundamental principles of international law. A spokesperson urged both sides to exercise maximum restraint to prevent the situation from spiraling into a wider regional conflict. More significantly, Beijing offered to play a constructive role in mediating the crisis, positioning itself as a potential peacemaker in a region where American influence has often dominated. China's position is, deeply rooted in its substantial economic and strategic interests in Iran. Beijing is Tehran's most important economic lifeline and its largest trading partner. Critically, China purchases over 90% of Iran's crude oil exports, a trade relationship that provides the Iranian regime with an estimated $150 million in revenue every single day. This economic interdependence is formalized through a 25-year strategic partnership agreement, which involves up to $280 billion in Chinese investments in Iranian infrastructure, energy, and technology. A full-blown war would not only jeopardize these massive investments but also disrupt a vital source of energy for the Chinese economy. The Chinese embassy in Tehran immediately issued an advisory to its citizens in Iran, describing the security situation as severe and complex, and urging them to take enhanced safety precautions. This reflects Beijing's concern for its nationals and its significant on-the-ground presence in the country. The conflict puts China in a delicate diplomatic position. Its pro-Iran stance and recent diplomatic successes, such as brokering the landmark Saudi-Iran rapprochement in 2023, have boosted its credentials as a major power broker in the Middle East. However, this has also reportedly strained its relationship with Israel, a key hub for technological innovation that China also values. Beijing now finds itself walking a fine line. It must support its strategic partner Iran without being drawn into the conflict or completely alienating Israel and its Western allies. Its offer to mediate is a classic Chinese diplomatic maneuver aimed at protecting its interests while enhancing its international prestige. The crisis serves as a major test for China's ambitions to be a global leader. How it navigates this complex geopolitical chessboard, whether its calls for restraint are heeded and whether its mediation efforts bear fruit, will have significant implications for its standing on the world stage and the future stability of the Middle East. India, another Asian giant with significant stakes in the region, responded to the crisis with carefully calibrated diplomacy. The Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi issued a statement expressing its own deep concern over the military escalation. Echoing a familiar Indian foreign policy principle, it urged both Israel and Iran to de-escalate immediately and return to the path of dialogue. In a direct diplomatic intervention, Prime Minister Narendra Modi held a phone call with his Israeli counterpart, Benjamin Netanyahu, on the day of the attack, presumably to convey India's position and gather first-hand information. The Indian government also acted quickly to protect its citizens, issuing advisories for nationals in both Iran and Israel to exercise extreme caution. India's predicament is uniquely complex, as it is one of the few major powers that enjoys strong and deep relationships with both sides of the conflict. The India-Israel partnership is a cornerstone of New Delhi's foreign and defense policy, Israel is a top supplier of advanced military technology to India, and the two nations collaborate extensively on intelligence, cybersecurity, and agricultural innovation. This strategic alliance is highly valued in New Delhi for its role in modernizing India's armed forces and boosting its technological capabilities. Therefore, India cannot afford to alienate Israel or be seen as siding against its security interests. At the same time, India's relationship with Iran is critically important for its strategic and economic ambitions. The most significant project is the Chabahar port, located on Iran's southeastern coast. India has invested heavily in developing this port as a key gateway to bypass rival Pakistan and gain access to the markets of Afghanistan and Central Asia. A war in Iran would not only halt progress on this vital connectivity project, but also threaten India's long-term geopolitical strategy to counter China's growing influence in the region, particularly its Belt and Road Initiative. Iran has also historically been an important source of crude oil for India's energy-hungry economy. This delicate situation forces India to perform a difficult balancing act. It must maintain its robust partnership with Israel while simultaneously safeguarding its strategic investments and historical ties with Iran. Unlike China, which is clearly aligned with Tehran, India must navigate a more neutral path, advocating for peace and stability without taking sides. The conflict puts immense pressure on India's foreign policy establishment. New Delhi's primary goal will be to prevent the conflict from expanding, as a regional war would severely damage its economic interests, disrupt energy supplies, and threaten the safety of the large Indian diaspora working in the Gulf region. The United States, Israel's most powerful ally, responded with a carefully worded statement designed to support Israel while avoiding direct entanglement. President Donald Trump clarified that American forces were not directly involved in the strikes, but confirmed that the United States had been informed in advance. In a message clearly directed at Tehran, he urged Iran's leaders to return to the negotiating table for a new nuclear deal, warning that failure to do so could lead to even more brutal Israeli attacks. In a precautionary move, the United States began withdrawing diplomats from its embassy in Iraq, authorized the voluntary departure of military families from the region, and repositioned a naval destroyer, the USS Thomas Hudner, to the eastern Mediterranean. The United Nations headquarters in New York quickly became a hub of diplomatic activity. Secretary General Antonio Guterres made an urgent appeal for maximum restraint from all parties, warning of the unpredictable and devastating consequences of further escalation. At Iran's formal request, the UN Security Council convened an emergency session to address what Tehran called a blatant act of aggression. Meanwhile, the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, also sprang into action. Director General Rafael Grossi condemned any military attack on nuclear facilities and announced an extraordinary meeting of the agency's Board of Governors for June 16 to assess the situation and the integrity of Iran's nuclear sites. Across the Arab world, reactions were swift and pointed. Saudi Arabia, Iran's main regional rival, joined Turkey in condemning the Israeli strikes. Both nations issued statements denouncing the attack as a violation of Iran's sovereignty and a breach of international law. Despite their own deep-seated tensions with the Iranian regime, they warned that such actions risked plunging the entire region into a wider conflict, destabilizing an already fragile security environment. Russia, a key player in the Middle East, also expressed its concern through a Kremlin statement that called for restraint and a return to diplomatic channels to resolve the underlying issues. European nations, however, were more divided in their responses. Germany, a major European power, attempted to strike a balance. While reaffirming Israel's fundamental right to self-defense against existential threats, it also strongly urged de-escalation to prevent a larger war. This reflected the difficult position of many Western countries, torn between their alliance with Israel and their desire for regional stability. In contrast, the Czech Republic offered a more full-throated endorsement of Israel's actions. A statement from Prague described the preemptive strike as a reasonable reaction to Iran's ongoing provocations and its pursuit of nuclear weapons, showcasing the fissures within the European Union on how to approach the crisis. The shockwaves from Operation Rising Lion were felt almost instantly in global financial markets, which react nervously to any hint of instability in the oil-rich Middle East. The price of Brent crude oil, the international benchmark, surged by a dramatic 7%, reaching a one-month high as traders priced in the risk of a major disruption to supply. The fear is that a wider conflict could threaten the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply passes. Any closure or militarization of this choke point would send energy prices soaring, with potentially catastrophic consequences for the global economy. Investors scrambled for safety, pulling money out of riskier assets like stocks and pouring it into traditional safe havens. The price of gold, a classic refuge in times of turmoil, spiked significantly, with notable surges in markets like India where gold is a popular investment. In contrast, European stock markets experienced a sharp downturn, with airline stocks being hit particularly hard. The prospect of a prolonged conflict, higher fuel costs, and massive airspace closures created a perfect storm for the aviation industry, sending shares of major carriers like Lufthansa and Air France-KLM tumbling. The economic fallout was immediate and widespread, a clear indicator of how interconnected the global economy is with Middle Eastern geopolitics. The conflict brought international aviation in the region to a grinding halt. In a swift and coordinated safety measure, airspace was closed over Iran, Iraq, and Jordan. This created a massive logistical nightmare for airlines operating the busy routes between Europe and Asia. Major carriers were forced to divert flights, adding hours to journey times and significantly increasing fuel costs. Air India, for example, reported that at least 16 of its international flights had to be cancelled or rerouted, stranding passengers and disrupting travel plans for thousands. The closures served as a stark, practical reminder of how quickly regional conflicts can have a global impact. The diplomatic fallout was just as severe, derailing crucial peace and negotiation efforts. High-stakes talks between the United States and Iran over the nuclear program, which were scheduled to resume in Oman on June 15, were immediately derailed, shattering hopes for a near-term diplomatic breakthrough. Similarly, a much-anticipated United Nations conference focused on Palestinian statehood, set to take place from June 17 to 20th, was postponed indefinitely. The military strikes effectively froze all diplomatic progress, replacing cautious optimism with the grim reality of conflict, and pushing any potential for peaceful resolutions far into the uncertain future. The world now stands at a dangerous crossroads, holding its breath as it waits for Iran's next move. The immediate future hinges on whether Tehran chooses a path of massive, direct retaliation or a more calculated, asymmetrical response. A full-scale counterattack on Israeli cities could trigger an all-out regional war, drawing in global powers and causing unimaginable devastation. Alternatively, Iran might opt to unleash its network of proxies, launching attacks through groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis. This would allow it to strike back at Israeli and Western interests without inviting an immediate, overwhelming war on its own soil, but it would still risk a deadly cycle of escalation. Global leaders are desperately trying to pull the region back from the brink. The United Nations Security Council, the G7, and various regional blocs are engaged in frantic, behind-the-scenes diplomacy. The central message from most world capitals is a unified call for de-escalation. The primary fear is that a single miscalculation from either side, a missile that goes astray, a civilian target hit by mistake, could ignite a conflagration that no one can control. Israel remains on its highest level of alert, with schools closed, its airspace shut, and tens of thousands of military reservists mobilized, prepared for the worst-case scenario. In this tense environment, the roles of China and India have become more critical than ever. China, with its significant economic leverage over Iran, is uniquely positioned to act as a restraining influence. Beijing's offer to mediate is not just diplomatic posturing, it has a vested interest in preventing a war that would cripple its energy supplies and strategic investments. Whether China is willing or able to use its influence to convince Tehran to moderate its response could be a decisive factor in the days ahead. A successful mediation would cement China's status as a global power broker, but failure could expose the limits of its diplomatic reach. India, meanwhile, continues its delicate balancing act. Its strong ties to both Israel and Iran allow it to act as a potential bridge for communication, a neutral party that both sides might be willing to listen to. India's diplomatic efforts will likely focus on advocating for restraint and reinforcing the global consensus against further escalation. The path forward is fraught with peril. The world can only hope that diplomacy prevails over the drumbeat of war. The actions taken by leaders in Tehran, Jerusalem, Washington, Beijing, and New Delhi in the coming days will determine whether the Middle East descends into a catastrophic new conflict or finds a narrow, precarious path back toward peace.